Welcome everyone to our breakout. We tried to discourage people from coming by calling it Getting Gnarly. So thank you all for braving the title and coming in here to talk about the whole question of attribution, incrementality. Ultimately, how do we understand the value of the money that we're investing in marketing? I'm Yossi Sinet. I lead up the research team in Kenshu. I've actually been with Kenshu for about 7 years. Research for us is everything from data science, algo development, analytics, all of that sort of stuff.
And am I on here? Okay, there we go. I am Brandon Wishnow, lead the measurement and activation team at Ovative Group. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, so even though it's cloudy, it's kind of nice to be here. We spend, our primary focus is on building customer and enterprise measurement solutions to really get at everything Yossi was sort of talking about, what we'll talk about today, to help you be smarter about investing in digital and your marketing.
Awesome. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to start by acknowledging that the world that we're all living in has become a lot more complex in terms of understanding customer interaction and the path to purchase or the path to conversion. And that can lead to some gaps in our data. And we're going to look at some of the solutions that are available to bridge those gaps and the challenges that those solutions, the new challenges that those solutions also present us with in the data. We're going to put forward a view that might not be shared by all, but this is what we think, which is that we're potentially hitting the limit in terms of what even the most sophisticated multi-touch attribution solutions can do for us in terms of understanding value. And what that means is that we need to find a new way to understand value, and that's what we're going to be proposing here today. So this is Jeff. Jeff exists, I guess, more than 10 years ago, before the mobile revolution. In fact, a little bit longer than that by the look of the non-flat screen monitor that he's looking at. When Jeff wanted to buy something online, which admittedly was probably pretty rare, the process was fairly simple. He went and he searched for something, maybe he clicked on an ad, and then he bought or he didn't. And all of that obviously happened only on one device because Jeff only had one device. And that device was a desktop computer. And pretty simple. With a cookie in a browser, you could connect those two events, and no one really asked too many questions about deduping, let alone attribution or incrementality. Well, fast forward to Emily. Emily,'s path to purchase is a little bit more complicated. She might be in the morning at home on her desktop computer, in her home office, looking online. She might continue that experience on her commute to work, throughout lunch, and on the way home on her smartphone. And then when she finally does purchase in the evening, and this is assuming that this all happens within the space of one day, she might be back at home either on a computer or on a tablet. And obviously there are a lot of opportunities to lose Emily through all of those transitions, to miss the fact that it was actually the same person doing all of these things who ultimately came and purchased. But there's some good news. And the good news is that there are tracking options out there that enable us to bridge some of those gaps. So obviously for the Jeffs of the world who and there are still Jeffs, they have varied in the sense that they're not just browsing on desktop computers anymore. But as long as everything's happening on the same device in the same browser, then the click-based, cookie-based approach is still pretty good in terms of tracking that. But for the Emilys of the world who are crossing devices and even crossing browsers on the same device, which is increasingly happening with in-app browsers, we need to find a way to bridge those gaps, and those ways are out there. Kenshu integrates with first-party cross-device data. We also integrate with probabilistic data. And as we announced today, we're going to be integrating with publisher data through the Facebook enhanced measurement. So that's great. And by the way, even if cross-device data has been available for a while, albeit undeduped against the rest of the universe from Google and from Facebook and Bing and all of the publishers through their pixels. So, and then there's obviously a fourth category, which is perhaps harder to track, but still possible, which is, you know, from any of these starting points through to things like apps and physical points of sale. And again, there are solutions to integrate all of this. There are a couple of problems, though. The first one is that as we add these data sources together, not all of them talk to each other and live in the same universe. Okay, so as I mentioned, some of your publisher data is going to be undeduped against the rest of your path to purchase. What do you do with that? Okay, same might be for some of the stuff that's coming from mobile measurement partners and offline. And then the other problem is that as I start to add more and more data, more and more ways to connect interaction to purchase, and the data starts to look more and more rosy, I start to believe it, less. It's like the more data I have, the less I know. Okay, I felt pretty certain about my click-based, cookie-based stuff, but my view-through conversions, how do I feel about those? My offline conversions, how do I feel about those? My cross-device data, how do I feel about those? Even in the last 2 days, I've heard more than one person contrast the data they're seeing from the Facebook pixel from the data they're seeing from their own MTA algorithm and say, I don't know what to do with that massive gap.
So as Yossi is describing, and I think Shahar was hitting on as well during the keynote earlier, there's always going to be gaps in the data. There's always going to be new touch points that are out there, or siloed data, or walled gardens, security policies that are preventing us from capturing that full path, you know, to purchase. But that's okay, because there's different forms of measurement that exist that allow us to help compensate for that. And even if you did have that perfect data set, even if you were able to stitch it all together in that perfect path, using attribution alone as your measurement solution is really only going to get you so far towards measuring incrementality. So as we see here, a number of different paths to purchase along many different types of touch points, brand search, non-brand, email, display, so forth. And what attribution can do is very important. It's a critical part of the enterprise measurement stack as we describe it, but not going to allow you to fill all the gaps with incrementality, and two in particular that we see as sort of a common misperceptions or confusions in the marketplace. First is, especially when considering or talking about this golden word of incrementality, it's not going to help you answer that single question of, if that one touch point was taken away, would that person still have converted? Which is one way of describing sort of what that incrementality question is. The second is, as you see titled here, audience bias. Different types of customers are more likely to take different paths along that path to purchase. So maybe Jeff is, you know, path number 2, or Emily is path number 1 here. If Emily is an existing customer, she's probably more likely to interact with branded search or those channels that are more loyalist-oriented. And what that will do is show here, let's say path number 1 here, 10%, it's going to inflate or artificially, let's say, inflate what the true value of those different touch points are, because it's all existing customers or more likely to be existing customers. Another path may be those that are watch lots of TV, but this is only a digital path, so it's not considering that, right? So it's weighting based on just this world when there could be those customers or different types of customers like Jeff, like Emmy, like the many others that are doing other things that are actually driving what that sale or what that impact actually is. So what do you do about that? We like to talk a lot or use the word causal with incremental or incrementality. What is the causal impact? And what we were just describing in terms of limitations on the prior slide is we can't really, you know, we can use attribution to weight the different touch points using many different models, even some of the most sophisticated that are out there, like Yossi was talking about earlier, but they're not really going to give you, at least on their own, that causality of that single variable and what it did on that path to purchase. So one way that we think about understanding causality or incrementality is by using experimentation or testing or incrementality testing. A good example here, or one way of looking at that, is based on geographies, where you have a test geography, a control geography, you have a test geography, and in the control, you're just going to keep things going, business as usual. in your test, you're going to change something. Just that one thing that you want to measure that causal impact on. For example, let's say that you wanted to measure the incremental impact or understand the causality of spending more on more paid search on mobile rather than desktop. So you decide I'm going to shift 50% of my desktop paid search spend to mobile in this test geography, and I'm going to keep everything the same in that control. And those markets ideally are as alike as possible, right? So all the different types of customers, the Jeffs, the Emilys, the others, are equally distributed ideally. The macroeconomic factors that are going on are all at play. You know, it's a really controlled environment, and just focusing on that one element. By doing so, and ultimately looking at the results, you can see ultimately whether or not that single variable that you've changed in that test geography, or in this case, shifting to mobile, actually had a causal or incremental positive or negative value on that, the sales, or again, or whatever your conversion is within that market. Super powerful. So to bring this to life a little bit more and see that tandem of attribution with incrementality, Yossi and I are going to walk through a couple examples. I'll start with one, and I'll pass it back on to him. So what you're seeing here is a real case study for one of our clients, calling out a summary of these three channels. Obviously, they're investing more broadly than just this. What you're seeing here is a common theme, I'd say, when using just attribution on its own for online sales specifically, which is what this is summarizing, what the return on ad spend is, or ROAS. And what you're seeing here is that the brand SEM looks super profitable. It's $37 ROAS, 37 to 1 ROAS. Non-brand SEM PLAs actually look less profitable when or not profitable when looking at online sales specifically or on its own. Just looking at attribution alone, you're questioning, is this right? How accurate is it? Can brand SEM really be that profitable? Going back to that audience bias question, when we know those are existing customers that are likely to purchase anyway, even if I wasn't buying that, would they actually still have converted? So it helps us, and this is where a huge value of attribution and different related sources of data like this is, it helps us inform our hypotheses. So what we used here is just by looking at this online MTA results, we formed a hypothesis that revenue from users searching on brand navigational terms are not 100% incremental. Pretty common question again. Where's that going? How incremental is it? If it was not there, would they have purchased, as I said? And what we found was super interesting. So we took the sort of approach that we looked at on the prior page around the different geographies and that set up that experiment and that control and test environment. And what you're seeing here on these charts are two charts, one around sessions, or called traffic, the other around revenue, comparing Geo A to Geo B, or test market, where we shut off brand SEM spend, versus the control market, where we kept it the same. And this was across devices. What we found was super interesting in that two charts, same story. Even though paid brand sessions and revenue are going down by close to 60% in both cases, the organic search traffic and revenue was picking up that miss, which is what this top red line is, to, in the yellow here on both charts, net out to be basically back to where they started or even, and answering that question in that test geography versus that control, how causal was that brand SEM spend, right, in actually driving along that path to purchase, because we took it out and saw what the results were compared to something that looked exactly like it, except for that one change in variable. Super interesting. What we found was, as I think mentioned here in the learning, is that for desktop, it was basically 0% incrementality, or in other words, the test market and control market, the sales for that on desktop looked almost exactly the same. For mobile, there was about 10% incrementality associated with it. So that means that in the test market, was had sales that were 10% less than what it was in the control. So there was some margin of incrementality here. It's important to caveat here that this is just one client. We're not saying this would be the same results for every client or every industry by any means, which is why it's also a very interesting test. It's also a place where a lot of our clients spend a lot of money, so it's super interesting to look at it. So going back to how that translates, though, is now we have our online multi-touch attribution results that we looked at before, but now we can factor in what that experimental results or that incremental or known incremental value for brand SEM is. And what we see here is it comes down, because of that just mobile positive 10%, considerably to $3.7. huge impact, huge value on its own for our clients where they were spending one of their largest portions of marketing investment, and now they understand the true incrementality or causality there to make decisions on, right, to optimize to, and give it to their agencies to consider to optimize based on. But that wasn't the whole picture, and as we were talking about earlier, there's sort of the online view or the different measurement types that you can use. But what about the enterprise view of the customer across, as Yossi was hitting on from a data perspective, the offline channels, across devices, existing customers, new customers, how are they all behaving? So the next question that was asked was, I'll leave it. How are these different channels impacting the percent of new customers or customer acquisition? And what we saw there was super interesting. What we found or thought earlier where PLAs or non-brand SEM were unprofitable for online are actually contributing or over-indexing with the percent of new customers that they're driving. But are those just one-time customers? Are they good customers? So now let's look at lifetime value of those new customers or just total customers overall to really understand what that long-term impact is going to be, not just in that week or current week. Let's now factor it in store and understand what's happening where 90% of the, in this case, sales are happening, understand what the ROAS is there when you can track all the way through to the store to get you ultimately to a enterprise ROAS across all these different points. And as you can see here, sort of the punchline is online MTA and the ROAS associated exclusively with that versus focusing on brand SEM here when you start to consider both the incremental view or incrementality of your brand SEM spend along that path, that enterprise view of the customer as well. The story that you see is very, very different, where it was $37 before, sort of went way down, but then we factored in the rest of these different touch points or interaction areas or values associated with that channel to get to just under $18. Before, there's another view of this where before we did any of this work, the enterprise ROAS that we saw was over, I think, assumed to be well over $100. So obviously $17 is still pretty good, but way, way below what we originally thought it was. So a good example of how attribution, that incrementality, and that enterprise view coming together can be a really powerful combination.
You can also get the opposites. You can get into a situation where you're where your tracking data, because it's imperfect, is underestimating the value of a specific publisher. And that can often especially be the case with new publishers, where not all of the pieces are there. So we worked with one of our retail customers who has a strong physical presence in a specific geographic area to actually look at the incrementality of Pinterest campaigns. So this was Pinterest social marketing. What we did is that we actually used the historical data that we had for that customer from other channels in order to actually create a geographic split in the geographies where they were strong. And then we ran a test where in one group we ran Pinterest campaigns, one group of geographies, one group of metro areas, and in the other group we didn't. And looking at the difference in revenue, in search clicks, in all of those things between those two geographies, from both our best baseline and test period, we were able to actually back out what the impact, the incremental impact was of those Pinterest campaigns. And we saw something pretty interesting. So first of all of the results of the test were statistically significant, even though we were looking at the entire revenue for this customer from digital and offline. So we're not talking about a massive incremental percentage in revenue, but the result was absolutely statistically significant. And not just that, although the percentage might not be massive, the ROAS is pretty astounding. What we saw was, and this is, I think, pretty good for a new publisher, the online ROAS was about 2.9x. That's much, much better than what you see from traditional click-based, cookie-based MTA because of all of the cross-device, cross-browser stuff. Pretty close to what we were seeing, by the way, with the Pinterest Pixel. And then in-store, we actually saw 31x ROAS, which was pretty astounding considering the online to offline piece. Although maybe it shouldn't be that surprising considering that, again, 90% of the sales, if not more, for this advertiser are occurring in store. So I should say that we're not telling you to ignore or throw away your multi-touch attribution. Multi-touch attribution is important, it's really helpful. But I will say something again that maybe not everyone agrees with, which is to me, multi-touch attribution is going to be really much more useful for in-channel, in-publisher optimizations, okay? For understanding the granular benefits of one keyword versus another, one product group versus another, one ad set versus another, multi-touch attribution is still going to be really important. But if you're looking to understand the incremental value of your channels, your publishers, your audiences, your devices, in order to make investment decisions, we believe that the way to go is through that incrementality testing. Well, what does that mean for you as advertisers? What would we say you should be thinking about and doing right now as a result of this? So the first one is to try and make sure that you're seeing and tracking everything, ideally in one place, and attributing as much of it as you can, okay? As in, yeah, take the time to invest in making sure that you're bringing in your in-app data, you're bringing in your offline data, you're doing that cross-device bridging so that you can attribute everything you can. By the way, some of you might think you're already doing this, and maybe you are, but I've seen a few cases recently of people who thought they were looking at everything, but actually they weren't. Like because they were using selectively firing pixels, okay, in order to limit the view in one system. Well, the thing about selectively firing pixels is they made a lot of sense in a click and cookie-based view of the world, but today, I'm not so sure. Using last click attribution means that you're probably not necessarily attributing everything that you can. And I just want to say for a second, and I realize that backing up this statement might take a half an hour or 45-minute conversation beyond this. But if you think about what you want to use MTA for, which is in publisher, in channel optimization, then making sure that you're giving those optimizers as much data as you can, right? That's what attribution is really about. And so using last click attribution is probably not doing that. And obviously, what value you should be attributing to them is unclear, but I certainly don't think that you should be ignoring the view-through stuff, the engagement-based stuff, the cross-device stuff, the offline stuff. Second thing I would advise you to do is start taking control of your testing. All of you test, right? All of you do A/B testing, I'm almost certain, for things like landing pages and site experience and creative and stuff like that. But I'm not sure how many of you are doing incrementality testing. And even if your organizations are doing it, it's possible that it's not in your hands. It's in the hands of an analytics team or someone like that who's taking it upon themselves. I think it's really important for you guys to own this stuff yourselves, because ultimately it's going to influence your decision making, and it's going to give you credibility within your organizations to be able to come and say that you understand the incremental value of your marketing. Incrementality testing sounds really difficult, but it doesn't have to be. Even in Kenshu, we're developing tool sets to help you with it, such as campaign mirroring, that is classic for doing geo-based tests, okay? You want to test the impact in mobile, like the one we described before, then 2 sets of mirrored campaigns, one where you set your mobile bid modifiers high, one where you set them low, and there you go, you've set up an incrementality test, which you can then report on in Kenshu through dimension tagging, through some of our geo insights, and through some of our path insight reporting as well. It also doesn't have to be as risky as it sounds. The tests that we've described are kind of very much on-off tests, but you don't have to do an on-off test, and you don't have to include your entire addressable market in these tests. You can choose to test on 20% of your market and create the test and control group from that, assuming there's enough data there. You can, instead of turning on-off, you can do a 50% reduction in spend, or a 30% reduction in spend, or a 30% increase in spend. It's not all black and white here. And as I'm talking, I realize that it sounds like there are a lot of options, and probably it might not be that clear where to start with this. And so I want to tell you that you're also not alone. Through Kenshu, with our analytics team, we're starting to work on some more incrementality testing, so you should certainly reach out to us if this is something you're interested in. And through your agency partners as well, I'm sure that you'll find partners who are definitely willing, like Ovative, to work with you on these kinds of tests. And the final thing I would say is that you shouldn't be waiting to inform your optimization with this data. If you have the data, then start using it. If you know the incremental value of mobile, and how that compares to what you're tracking to mobile, then use your mobile revenue multiplier in KPO to optimize to it. If you know now the difference in incrementality between your brand campaigns and your non-brand campaigns, then use a custom metric in our optimization to optimize to that. If you know that there is different incrementality for different audiences in Facebook, then again, use your custom metrics in order to use that data to inform your optimization. That's one thing that you can do. The other thing that you can do, and this is something that Ovative have recently started doing with us, is actually bring in external metrics. So if you've got someone calculating enterprise revenue and enterprise ROAS for you, then bring that into Kenshu through our integrations and through our external reports, and we can optimize off of that. That is, I think, everything we wanted to say. So thank you very much for listening. We've got a little bit more time, so we'd be happy to take questions and discuss.